the end of the day, I think that if you added all those up, you'd realise the system is not cheaper. And I think you can look at California and ask yourselves, is that system cheaper? And so I just think that...
Pause taking pot shots on where we are right now and paint a vision.
Here we are. I'm joined by Simon Holmes and Mr. Aidan Morrison. I'd almost ask you to share your Twitter handles, but I'm so glad to be leaving Twitter out of this. It's a place that we've all interacted on. Perhaps, hasn't been the highest of any of our moments, but it's a place where we met. So I'm grateful for it, but I'm so grateful to be here in person with, I think, two of the sort of legends of Australian energy analysis. So without further ado, welcome, guys.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Certainly, I've been in Australia now for almost 2 weeks, and there's competing visions, I guess, and a lot of controversy. It seems like the upcoming election is really an election almost dominated by energy, the role of nuclear energy. Maybe I'll start with you, Simon. How are you feeling right now? I guess just being in this place and being here with Aidan, I'll leave it open to you, but off of Twitter, real time.
Yeah, well, I think it's surreal that we are talking nuclear energy. I don't think it is the topic of the next election. I think the topic of the next election will be three things: cost of living, and cost of living.
Yeah.
The case I made earlier today is that nuclear is not a solution for that, not now and not for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's quite bizarre that it has come to dominate. Mm-hmm. At least the interactions between us. Yeah.
Very interesting. Cost of living. Aidan, what are your perspectives on this upcoming election and the overall energy landscape?
I agree with Simon. Cost of living is probably the dominant kind of theme that will be most important, but I disagree about whether that means that nuclear is a relevant thing to that debate, because there's only so many things, short of just handing out bigger welfare checks or tax breaks, that the government can do about people's actual hip pocket nerves. And I think energy policy is something that people have in their minds, and it's not untrue that is a lever for affecting the economy, but also cost of living. So I think that the energy debate, to the extent that what's being done or proposed by the other parties could affect cost of living, has the potential to be really big in this election still. So I think it makes sense to be talking about it, and I think that it's a growing, just emerging at the moment, is the sense that we are not quite sure that the current path is going to lead to lower electricity prices, big emission that was made clearer in Senate estimates. I think it's always been in there in the fine print, but made clearer in not Senate estimates, a Senate committee this week, that the current path to a grid dominated by renewables might not be cheaper. And I think that's the case, definitely, and I think that means that nuclear should be on the table.
I think there's a really important distinction there. The claim is, what is the cheapest path forward? And certainly for the next 20 years, we know what the cheapest path forward for Australia is, and that's some version of what we're on. Nuclear is not going to play a role in the next 20 years. There's not a hope in hell. There's no possible world in which nuclear plays any meaningful role in our grid in the next 20 years. What we do know now is that the current costs of nuclear are also greater than the costs that are currently facing us, that are costs on the table. So even in 20 years, if it started to come on, it's not an alternative that pushes prices down. It's actually an alternative that pushes prices up. And I know, Aidan, you haven't, you don't accept that as fact. And one thing that sort of dominated our discussions is that for you, that's a hunch. The work hasn't been done yet to show that you haven't yet explained to people how nuclear could bring costs down. You've only picked holes in the existing plan.
Before you respond, Aidan, is there a consensus between you both that whatever comes next for a certain period of time is going to raise prices and cost more?
I don't agree with that.
Okay.
I don't agree with that. Firstly,
so our electricity bill is going to come down in the next, say, 5 years, significantly. Prediction. You could make a long. You guys could make a long bet.
In nominal terms,
Yeah.
in nominal terms, I don't expect electricity prices to come down because only a third of our electricity bill is energy, right?
Yeah. It's generation.
Is the generation. The vast majority of our bill, transmission and distribution, the profits of the retailers, taxes. There are all sorts of things that go into your bill. The dominant driver of our electricity of the energy portion, that 1/3, the dominant driver of that right now is gas. The dominant reason why our bills have gone up in recent time in Australia is because gas prices have gone up.
Right.
So I can't tell you whether prices are going to come up or down because none of those levers are ones that we can forecast. But what I can say is lots of work has been done to work out what is the lowest cost path forward.
Sure.
And all the evidence is that the path of wind and solar growing from where they are right now, firmed up with hydro and storage, and backed up with gas is the cheapest path forward.
Mm-hmm. Before I get you to respond, Aidan, just a perspective from a bumbling, ignorant, non-Australian. There seems to be a commonality really around the Western world that we are cruising on amortized infrastructure of whatever. We like to malign them as the boomer generation, but they built a lot of stuff that we benefit for. It's paid off. It's providing pretty cheap power, but it's going to be retiring in the not so distant future. And so I guess that would infer that we need to make large investments, if they're nuclear, if they're fossil, if they're solar and wind.
Yeah.
It's all going to cost
That's certainly a
something.
feature in, well, Australia, like the US, and I think Canada the same, had massive construction projects through the 70s and early 80s.
Yeah.
We had this idea that the growth would go on forever. These are like 7% increase year on year on energy demand. And it didn't eventuate. So we entered this century with a surplus of generation, and we had a decade or so with underutilized assets, really cruising along, fully amortized, low-cost fuel, and that in Australia at that point, our gas wasn't connected to international markets. We had cheap gas. Yeah. Gradually, we've seen that capacity age out, and you look at the age profile. Everything is old, and then we've got we've hardly built anything except for renewables in the last 15 years or so. Right. So we have been cruising on the boomers' infrastructure. And the truth is, we now have to
make an investment.
Make investments.
And the question is what? So, I mean, that was something that came up in an earlier conversation today. Was this idea of what path are we on with deployment of renewables? We certainly know, looking at the deployment of nuclear, that it has followed an S-curve. There was a period of linear and then exponential growth, and that tapered off, and it very much aligns with what you're describing, that kind of overcapacity.
Outside of China, the world has produced less energy last year from nuclear than it did in 1995.
Yeah. So I think what was interesting today is considering, well, where are we at in terms of other forms of energy deployment? And in Australia, where there has been a very impressive addition of renewables over the last 10 years, Aidan, what is your perspective? Are we, on an exponential curve, or is that going to continue? Do you feel like we're on an S curve, similar to nuclear at some point? What is your take on what the future deployments will look like, and any kind of limits to growth?
I think that we have just finished the honeymoon period of renewable energy, basically. There's no doubt that renewable energy standalone, the individual units at the current prices, are very, very low. To buy a solar panel, to buy a wind turbine, that energy. But that assumes that you're willing to accept it at the times and places where it's abundant. So if you can accept that kind of comes in gushes and rushes kind of energy, and just turn down the other system you have, which is what the privilege you have for a while in a low penetration of these variable renewable energy, then it's quite cost effective. It doesn't do too much. Doesn't require too much extra. But I think we've just hit, basically just now, this point of, I think, a leveling out where the easy part is now done, and from here on, and we're seeing this in the NEM, the National Electricity Market, that there are times when the sun is shining, the wind is blowing, we have too much energy at a certain time, and often enough we have too much in certain places where there's abundance. And so now the really hard part starts, where we have to start moving energy around the clock or around the country or around the calendar. And that's the expensive bit. So I think that the cheap bit is just about done. And from here on, and here's the connection to, I think, the idea of what's going to happen to electricity prices and what could nuclear do about it. We're about to make these phenomenal investments, extremely large investments in that infrastructure right now to move energy around the clock, country and calendar. And I think that that is what could push electricity prices up in the next few years. As we both agreed, generation of the electricity is the smaller part of the overall bill stack, and a lot of those distribution assets are more significant. At the moment, we're about to make those big parts grow in order to prepare for high levels of renewable energy. And if we changed our vision of what the end state looked like to being something that had more nuclear replacing that, even if it arrives in 10 or 15 years, that could substantially reduce.
20. There's not a hope in how it
could reduce how much we pay for electricity now.
We've got to stop talking about 10 or 15, right?
Before we get into that.
Not at all viable.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Simon. But before we get into that, so in terms of the quantity of renewables imagined on the system, 82% by 2030, or 2031, or 20, whatever, or 90%. When's the goal for 90%?
It's about 2034 or 5.
Okay,
Yep.
So is Australia? I mean, I understand there's other jurisdictions that are a little further along right now in renewables deployment that we can look to, places like Denmark with a lot of interconnection. Certainly, reviewing some of the statistics and data coming out of China, it is unreal how much solar is being added per year. But that being said, everything is growing in China. I think the percentage of renewables is increasing as well. But as Aidan was pointing out, I'd love to hear maybe a rebuttal of this. It seems like that can still be well accommodated within the Chinese system because the penetration of variable renewable energy is under 20%, if I've got my numbers correct. So is there somewhere you would point to in terms of kind of this evidence for this being economic, or that we're not hitting the headwinds, that there's still sort of a glide path as we continue renewables?
The way we understand systems before we build them is to model them, right? And we often talk amongst ourselves that the famous George Box quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? Yeah. So it is extremely easy to get any model and pick it apart. Mm-hmm. The first people to pick those models apart are the modelers themselves. They'll tell you the simplifying assumptions they made. The challenge that I put to anyone picking apart models is to identify the fatal false assumptions. And I don't believe that work has been done on the multiple studies done on Australia show that it's very clear that the cheapest path forward for us is to build. We're not starting from scratch, right? You've got to start from where you are, where we are with our grid right now. And our demand's growing. We've got power stations that are becoming less reliable every year and are aging out. Right? You can't patch these things up forever, and the government doesn't own them anyway, right? In most cases. So we can't just stop for the next the next 20 years. We can't stop and not do anything. We have to have a solution for, we actually have to have a solution for the electricity system second by second, but certainly year by year. And that means investment decisions have to be made today. Right. And they were made last week, and they were made last year and the year before. One thing in Australia, since we had a massive uptick in renewables starting around 2018. And the major change that happened then was actually the economics of renewables changed around 2018. Before then, renewables needed heavy subsidies to get into the system. Around then, the costs came that it became economic to get them into the system. And Australia we added the equivalent of one nuclear power station a year, not in capacity terms, in energy terms. We've added one reactor equivalent every year for 6 years in a row. I don't buy the narrative that we've hit any kind of wall right now. But one of the most exciting things that is happening is the massive uptick in storage in Australia.
Before we talk about that, let's just get Aidan's response or perspectives.
Yeah, sort of, I suppose, just very briefly on this question of whether we've hit a wall and whether that recent history reflects a kind of economic tailwind that's continuing to work. It might be right that, at a point where prices declined enough for the installation of these things, there was a sweet spot where more or less, there was still actually a few things, as you know, the large-scale generation certificates. There were a few privileges given to renewables, but a fair bit of economic tailwind was behind installing these things. But I would still maintain, I think this is an open secret that I'm not sure whether you disagree with, you can if you want to, Simon, but the introduction of large underwriting schemes from the governments to say that we will underwrite a revenue stream is a reflection of now that we're starting to see the capture price for wind and solar tip downwards, and they can't get the average price guaranteed for a long-term takeoff. So I think that there is evidence that has just about dried up. But I'd really like to return to this question of kind of, the modelling, and if that's the evidence that we have for a future system that can reach these very, very high levels, then I think it's essential that we do turn a critical eye to the models. And I think if the challenge is to find fatal flaws in them, I'm happy to name one or two. And in particular, in the integrated system plan, the assumption that we will double that growth rate, not like 1 gigawatt of reactor worth of renewable energy, but 2. That assumption that will occur very quickly and be sustained for the next 10 or 15 years is driven by policy constraints that are imposed on the model. It's not a trajectory that is driven by natural headwinds or what's been achieved before. And so that's one, I think, fatal flaw. But the other one that I think is really easy is the assumption that we don't include the costs in that model for critical enabling parts, things that are indispensable to the system, such as the large amounts of storage from consumer energy resources, and the assumption that consumers will shift everything from charging their EVs, buy a lot of EVs to start with, but shift their consumption so we can basically flex our consumption to match the sunshine and have huge peak in consumption during the middle of the day, which is not the case. And so there's some huge assumptions that I would say are just critical, but not including that huge amount of storage, I would say is a fatal flaw.
None of these are fatal.
Storage, go for it.
Well, okay, so storage. So Australia built the first mega battery in the world, the Hornsdale Power Reserve, which famously Elon Musk and Mike Cannon-Brookes made a bet late one night on Twitter. It's one thing that's fun about that is there's a report from AEMO that was published that morning saying that batteries were good, but up to around about 100 kilowatt hours, right? It was 10 hours later that a bet was made on a battery that was 100 megawatt, 120 megawatt hours. So it was a step change in what was thought to be possible. It was much derided at the time by our right-wing media.
So what's happening with batteries? Is it following a similar cost reduction and following a similar sort of scaling law that we're seeing in solar?
The scaling is growing at a much faster rate than we saw solar grow in this country. So the first unit was 1/8 of a gigawatt hour. It took us 6 years to get to 1 gigawatt hour. That was to the end of 2022. In 2023, we added another gigawatt hour. This year, we're adding 3.5, and next year we already have shovels in the ground building another 10. So the chart is going up like that. And as we've seen we can see in the Californian grid what's happening with the massive. They're probably a year ahead of us with that kind of adoption rate. We're seeing gas in the early evening is being replaced by battery storage. So we're seeing quite a fundamental shift in those markets where the storage is coming in, where it addresses this problem that Aidan's talking about of having too much of energy. Well, I mean, too much energy just means that you've got super cheap energy in the middle of the day, and these batteries are actually being paid to charge in the middle of the day, and they're discharging in the evening.
I do have something to get in equipped to get in just a moment, but I'm going to sit on it and again give you a kind of right of response there if you like, Aidan.
Look, my very simple sort of response is that's well and good. Simon's described the structure of the battery stepping in to start moving energy around the clock, and it's increased quite a bit. You just need to map out properly the system that increases it all the way far enough to actually solve the problem. And I think that's not yet been done in the integrated system plan because an enormous fraction, I think it's in the order of 100 or so gigawatt hours, I could check that. It might be 70 or something like that, is from batteries that model does not cost, which are the batteries that they assume the household will buy. And I think those assumptions are basically very weak. And it's been said multiple times, they're working on the economics, they're reforming the markets, trying to create the incentive structures But at the end of the day, I think that if you added all those up, you'd realise the system is not cheaper. And I think you can look at California and ask yourselves, is that system cheaper? And so I just think the models, the principles are right, but my simple question is like, get far enough and tell me the full system cost, and let's see a model that has it all in there, and I don't think the overall system is cheaper.
Just to keep things, interesting, well, I think they're quite interesting, but I wanted to get in this little quip. Would you say, because there seems to be a lot of consensus in the modeling community, would you say that the modeling community suffers from a diversity, equity, inclusion problem? And I'm not talking about gender and race here necessarily, although that may be an issue. In terms of the perspectives that are coming into the modeling community, does it tend to be sort of academics, lefties, on the climate concern side of the spectrum, or do you feel like the modeling community is very representative? Or is it missing some perspectives you think that might be changing biases, assumptions, etc.?
I think you just have to look at the participants in the Net Zero Australia study, which, Robin Batterham was the chair of that. I mean, guy sits on the advisory council of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship with Michael Schellenberger. You don't have any left-wing ideologues on that group. You've got
the report doesn't say it's cheap though either. It says that
it says the cheapest path forward
that gets to net zero,
and it also gives nuclear an opportunity to shine in that, and finds that nuclear doesn't play a role. In fact, it's very clear in saying that nuclear doesn't play a role. But what I want to talk about modelling is it's very easy to pick apart a model and say, I don't like this bit or I don't like that bit. The onus on someone doing that is first to show that it's fatal. But the real task is to show us a better model, right? And that's what hasn't been done. There is nobody who has put together a credible model saying, your ISP and Net Zero Australia and the 20 other models like it that come to the same basic conclusion. No one has said, they're all wrong, here is a better path forward. If someone can do that, I will be there on the front lines advocating for that. But we can't stop, right? We can't stop right now and say we're not going to build anything for the next 10 years or next 20 years while we wait for nuclear to come on. And that's just the first kilowatt hour, not the 20, 30, 40 gigawatts we would need. Someone who thinks that we're on the wrong path needs to put together a model that makes sense. And Aidan, you haven't done that. And the CIS haven't done that. Nobody credible has put together a plan that shows a better path than the one we're on. So I don't know, if I'm flying on a plane and you say, I don't believe this thing can stay up in the air because it's heavier than air, I'm going to say, well, thank you. I'm going to sit here until you come up with a better solution than what I'm currently doing right now.
And it may not be strapping a parachute off and jumping out over the ocean. Do you have a response to
that? Do the work.
Look, I just think that we have different views about sort of the function and role of modelling and how complex the system has to be. Like I have a sort of pretty simple, intuitive grasp. I know you hate intuition, but I think sometimes models can be at least as misleading if you trust them blindly, right? So systems that are going to be cheap are systems that use what is in them consistently and regularly. So where you've got lots of things that are only used a little bit in any kind of system, it's bound to be expensive, and that's what you have to have if you're going to take the kind of feast and famine energy that's produced by intermittent renewables at a large scale. There can be a role, but if you're trying to make a system that's 100% composed out of that, you're going to have a whole bunch of systems in there that are used only a little bit. So it has to be moving the electricity across space a lot, but only sometimes a lot, and the rest of the time you'll have an idle asset. Same with the batteries too.
So show us a better path. Show it. We cannot not invest in our system. So what is the better path?
If we're not convinced that we are on a sustainable, on a trajectory to a proper endpoint that is economically sustainable, the right thing to do actually is to stop and reassess the path we're on. I'm sorry, it feels as though we have to make progress each and every year.
So the experts are on board with this. The people who are running the network, the system that is responsible for keeping these lights on right now, it believes that we are on. That the decisions we make today are the best decisions that are available to us today. If you want to change the trajectory, there's mechanisms to do that, but you have to show a different vision, and you haven't shown that vision.
I think that it's essential that we just have honesty about the costs that we have in the vision. Building a full system model to the standard that would satisfy you, Simon, is an extremely expensive project, and I would actually love to do it, but we need some serious funding to actually subscribe to the software and build out the team and do what would satisfy you, Simon. So
firstly, you can do a sketch of it on a napkin, right? And then you can take that to Excel and do it in like half a day, and then you can take it into open source modeling tools and do it in a week. And then if that looks good, you're going to get funding and you're going to get $500,000 to put it into an advanced model. There is a pathway that thousands of academics have worked before on this, that integrated resource plans around the world, planning groups. There's tool sets, there are ways of doing this. And what frustrates me is that you don't have an alternative. You haven't done the work, right? Just show us something that's better than where we're. Criticize where we're going by all means. Absolutely. I don't. But it's all noise until you come up with something that is better than what we are on right now.
I think that we have to basically acknowledge there's a problem at the moment. At the moment, we've got this kind of perception that we're on this smooth glide path that the ISP will work. And when you say the experts are behind this, I absolutely look forward to the rest of this Senate inquiry and this House inquiry, because the experts, they admit the things they put in their model that says this is going to work are forced in there by government policies. It's not a trajectory.
But you would be verbaling me to say this is going to be a smooth path. This is a messy transition, right? We could be smoother, but this is a messy transition. The question is, what is the better transition? And until you've got something better, what else can we responsibly do other than what we have modelled to be the best path forward?
Look, I think that to take the challenge on the chin, right, to say a better model can sketch it out on the back of an envelope, and I think that the better model, the faster model to get to actually very, very low carbon means we do pause the rollout of renewables at something like this level, and we do invest in large-scale nuclear, which might take 15, if you want 20 years to be really significant.
So make the case.
But I think this is going to be a faster and cheaper way of getting to a low-cost, reliable
but that's
system.
just a gut feel. There are very simple tools that we have for you to show that is a better way. Do the work.
I think that it is trivial, almost in the back of an envelope, to look at the projects we're currently investing in, like Snowy 2.0, which is going to cost about $20 billion just to store energy and move it around the calendar. Could build a reactor for that sort of money. Pioneer Burdekin, again, a similar amount of money, 14, 20. Barumba, these pumped hydro projects. If you look at Central West Arana, $5 billion. And so
you can reel off these numbers, but do the work.
I'm actually happy just saying that I think that we can count 4 or 5 reactors just for the supporting infrastructure for renewables. I'm so confident that
4 or 5 reactors gets us nowhere.
Is it nowhere? Tell us, Chris. What do you think? Is that a nowhere?
4 or 5 reactors gets us less than 10% of the generation that we have, that we're going to have in the 25 years it's going to take to deliver them.
And then if we do another 4 or 5 reactors after that, for the rest of the rollout, until we have the full costs on the table, we can't actually say that we can't afford to do this.
No, but do the work. Make a plan. Show us that it is better than the path we're on, and I'll be right behind.
My hand up. Need $500,000, and the work will be done.
You don't need $500,000. Okay. I'll do it. We could do it in Excel this afternoon to show that there is a viable path here, if it is viable.
Is there anyone else that's tried this sort of model? I think there are actually people that have done their own sort of reduced models as well that are power systems engineers, and they think there's a cheaper path, but they haven't met your satisfaction, like the likes of Robert Barr, etc. Or Robert Parker.
It's a junk of a model, right?
Yeah, I think we've probably started to dredge the bottom of the pot here in terms of this part of the conversation. But you did mention Net Zero Australia. One of the concerns that I have, and this might be a little vibey and intuition-y, right?
It's not my model. It's not the government's model.
No, but I think you're on the board of the Superpower Institute, which
it's not our model either.
Okay, I mean, so do you find that model to be, for instance, I think
it's a strange. There's a strange assumption in the model.
Yeah. But just to describe, maybe you can describe a little bit what Net Zero Australia imagines, because for me again, my intuition and vibes are that it is going to be very, very hard to. Maybe powering commercial, residential demands is achievable. It may be expensive, but achievable. But I think that this vision of Australia attracting investment to build up a sort of green industrial revolution of aluminum smelters, of polysilicon manufacturing, lithium hydroxide processing, all incredibly electricity intensive processes. Yep. Which are very sensitive to disruption. And so there's a model.
When you say sensitive to disruption, you mean what?
The processes, making
intermittent supply.
Yeah, there's a disruption in power supply,
and there won't be, right? There's no design on the table.
So I guess the question is it's foreseeable, and I'm willing to concede there's a possibility that system envisaged there could power those kind of facilities. What if it can't, though? What does that mean for the future of Australia in terms of its ability to participate in reshoring of industry and maintaining its economic complexity?
So are we assuming a decarbonising world, right? We are, right?
Not necessarily.
Well, if we're,
it depends on the degree of decarbonizing, I guess. Right?
I mean, I think if we, I don't think that. Australia doesn't have Australia doesn't have an economic advantage in nuclear, right? We don't, right? What possible advantage do we have in nuclear?
We have a lot of uranium. We have a well-established medical research facility. We have
we have a tiny little research reactor, as do
excellent places to store waste if we want to store it underground. But we don't have to do that anyway. It's not a problem, right? But we have a highly literate skill. I studied nuclear science at university, and my first job was to be a barista in a cafe, a first full-time paid job. So I think that we have the skills to do this.
Construction costs in Australia are particularly high. And our infrastructure costs, on any global competitiveness scale with infrastructure, it is not our forte. We are not going to be able to outcompete build nuclear in Australia cheaper than nuclear in, say, China.
Okay, Aidan, in your opinion, is it feasible for Australia to become an industrial powerhouse that attracts investments and become a leader in electricity intensive heavy industry like polysilicon, lithium hydroxide processing, aluminum smelting?
Well, we were that, sort of are, but it's on the way out, right? We had extremely cheap for a while coal. The state electricity commissions built an awful lot of it. There was no shortage in the ground. They built the plants. They cost quite a bit at the time, and they were somewhat inefficiently maybe managed. Maybe I've heard compelling stories that the operations improved, but they built it. And some industry did come and soak up that spare electricity. So it's not a question of is this sort of hypothetical, sort of unknown possibility going to occur. It's pretty formulaic. If you have extremely reliable, very low cost electricity, those industries can and will come. And I actually think that there's heaps of evidence that we have now reached that inflection point where the next increment of renewable energy will cost significantly more than the system we have today, which I think is already interrupted by renewables and probably struggling to be the most efficient version of that highly productive system. So I think that the evidence we see, the introduction of the capacity investment scheme, the fact that power prices are still quite high, all the effort that's been gone to withhold the cost in the integrated system plan from the public eye. I mean, they know they calculate
rubbish. It's rubbish.
No, well, we've seen
no effort has gone to withholding costs.
Can I share this with you? We absolutely do know this, that the market modelling team at the Department of Climate Change did ask AEMO whether that calculated the effective carbon price, the shadow carbon price in the model. And the answer was yes, but we're not at liberty to share that information with you. So there is a cost. We do know how much more the parts of the system that have actually modelled more will cost than without that, and it's not being shared publicly. So we get back FOIs all the time. One just now from the South Australian government, fully redacted advice to the minister about what the future cost of electricity will be in South Australia, which is leading the charge. I mean, we can sort of guess from these signals that things are not going to be cheaper. Things will definitely be more expensive. So if we're already at this point now, where it's going to be more expensive the further we go, and we all know that, it can't be the case that we all have industry flooding back.
We do not agree with that.
So how far do we need to get in terms of the scale and quantity of the solar panels and lithium backups and gas? How big does that need to reach that critical mass to pull in the industry and create cheap power for industrial loads?
So in a decarbonising century, and I would say that this is a decarbonising century, and it better be.
Are you inferring like there's carbon taxes that make these processes more?
Not only, I mean, the world. Firstly, the world is committed.
Sure.
Whether they're following through on everything they need to, right?
I just want to understand what the assumptions are in terms of decarbonization. Okay. How does that change or make Australia more competitive in that decarbonizing world? Is it
so? There are many. There are many mechanisms. Yeah. The carbon border adjustment mechanism will mean that steel that is produced using metallurgical coal will pay a tariff when it enters Europe. The US is probably going to follow at some point, and that tariff will prop up Europe and the US, but it'll keep out those who don't enter into, make significant efforts to reduce their carbon. So in a decarbonising century, and I would posit that we are definitely in a decarbonising century, Australia has a massive energy advantage. We have the world's, we talk about Australia being, having these boundless plains, and it's a sunburnt country, right? We have the highest per capita amount of renewable energy resources, wind and solar, of any country, any major country in the world. We have these phenomenal resources, and we have the skills. We're demonstrating the skills to build renewables at scale. Currently, we send our iron ore overseas, and we send our metallurgical coal overseas for them to combine them and turn them into dishwashers and cars, which we buy back, right? Yeah. Through an accident of physics, it makes no sense to send hydrogen to turn iron ore into steel in another country and then bring it back. Yeah. Right? But if we are moving away from metallurgical coal, and I think we will over this century, then the smelting of iron ore will be made where the hydrogen the alternative from using metallurgical coal is to use hydrogen. So we will see an onshoring of minerals processing to Australia, not because of, you made it sound this morning like it was some kind of charity thing that people might, No. But the capital will flow to Australia because we will be the cheapest place in the world from which to turn spodumene to lithium carbonate, to turn bauxite into aluminium, to turn iron ore into green steel. So we will see these industries move to the places that have the cheap energy, and Australia will have the cheapest energy in this century.
And what could get, you said, in a decarbonizing world, what if the world stops decarbonizing, maybe because of a change in politics or a cost of living crisis affecting politics? Will that make these assumptions no longer valid and Australia won't be a cheaper source? Or?
I mean, if the world just permanently gave up on reducing... I'm not
saying permanently, but I mean, if carbon policies are relaxed in the EU because populist governments come into power.
The path to net zero globally will be lumpy and bumpy, right? There will be... there will be political movements for and against it, but the trajectory is that we decarbonize global economy. It'll be lumpy and bumpy on the way down, but as the further we go down that pathway, the more prosperous Australia is.
Right. So one stat I came across in my perusing of facts and figures about Australia was that the economic complexity index rating has dropped from 95 to like 50th position. Yeah. You're just above Uganda, just behind Pakistan. That seemed a bit, worrisome to me. In North America, I find the politics are really tending towards this idea that it's kind of a national security issue to reshore, bring chip fabrication back, for instance. Yeah. A bit worrisome because I think part of what keeps world peace right now is the kind of mutually assured economic destruction of disrupting those flows. But Aidan, you've heard a vision for this kind of not just maintaining the declining economic complexity you have, but diversifying again and reindustrializing. Are you sympathetic to that? And what sort of power system do you think is able to achieve that?
I think that Simon's premise at the end of the day, that the world will decarbonize at the rate that means it's all done this century. I mean, I'm not to say that's not a reasonable goal, but I just don't think it's given. I just don't think we can assume that will have to happen, because I think what you've described is a world where we create economic interests to preference and privilege and kind of push people towards these green-made steel and alumina, etc. And we might have a competitive advantage in that. But if the world is not willing to pay the premium in the cost to actually have all those projects decarbonized, then it won't happen. And that's the problem that we have, I think, in the world, is that people want to decarbonize. They really want us to reduce global warming. People can see it as concern. But push come shove, standards of living matter. And if you double or triple the cost of all the things that make our world work, like aluminium and steel and cement and agricultural fertilizer, that sort of thing, it has a material impact on standard of living, right? So people will pay a small premium, but just hear me out, Simon, for a moment.
No one's talking about tripling anything.
Well, but we haven't got the plans with the full cost, and actually the cost of the energy exports in the net zero Australia is, I think, a tripling. The cost of the energy we export to the world in the onshore refined materials is roughly a tripling. So I think we need to take this seriously. Until you've got a destination which looks like it is only at a premium that you think politics in the long term will pay, there's no point assuming the whole world will decarbonize, because lumpy and bumpy is not what it is. If in reality you're about to hit a wall where the easy bit of renewables is finished, and from here on it gets really, really expensive, and we are looking at a doubling, tripling. So we need to have perfect honesty from the institutions to say, how much does the whole system cost? And is this whole system going to be at a cost that we can accept?
You're saying we're at a point where we're deciding, are we going to decarbonise or not? Is that what you're wanting to open up the discussion on?
No, I don't think so. But I think we have to have an honest conversation about the trajectory, because I think there's a lot of focus that's put on the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And ultimately, if you don't have a sustainable, credible vision for how you get through the next 10 or 15 years to the end point, then you've got to readjust that timeline. You have to have something that works. And so I think that we should, but I think that it might take us significantly longer than that. And I think that we need to be honest about how fast that can happen.
Luckily, we do have a plan for the next 25 years. And this plan is reevaluated every 2 years.
What's it called?
It's called the Integrated System Plan. And it is updated every couple of years. We've just had our 4th edition of it. It's open for submissions. I'm sure you're going to submit to it. And there's a Senate inquiry that we'll touch on it. And I hope it does include nuclear at some point. In 2020, they did do a sensitivity with nuclear, and they found out that nuclear was too expensive to get selected. I think that'd be the case with reasonable assumptions put in right now. But if the time comes where the nuclear industry is able to deliver projects on time, on budget, in reasonable amounts of time, then we'll see it start coming into these long-term scenario plans. And great, but by all means, if it stacks up. But I think it is entirely irresponsible to be saying, stop everything. I mean, if we stop everything, the lights go out, right? But to say, stop everything because I got a feeling that there's a better plan, right? You haven't done the work to show people that there is a better plan.
Well, let me comment on the ISP, because the ISP has also not added up the full system cost. It's become absolutely clear. So I would do the same thing. Put the onus back on the market operator that do have substantial resources. They should have put in the full system cost, so we could at least have an honest assessment of whether it's viable.
I think that's a red herring.
Gentlemen.
The full system cost thing is an absolute red herring that you've introduced to the debate to confuse people on this, but it is a key source of your confusion on the integrated system plan. And please, let's sit down and have someone explain it to you in detail.
Whew. I feel like you need like 30 seconds, and then we're going to have to... Okay, great. All right. I'd like to end, a lot is at stake here, obviously. Decarbonization is at stake. The Australian economy is at stake. What degree of certainty, you guys have, I think, strongly staked positions. If you had to give yourself sort of a percentage in terms of, I am 100% certain, I'm 95% certain, that your respective sort of visions can live up to their expectations.
Can we define the vision? Because my vision, all I'm saying is that the path forward, we have demand going like this, we have our coal generators going like that, we've got an opening gap in the middle that needs to be addressed. How do we fill that gap? I am extremely confident that the cheapest thing for us to do to fill that gap is wind, solar, backed up with hydro, firmed with hydro and storage, and backed up with gas, right? I am extremely confident that that is the best path forward until someone shows me a better path.
I guess confidence that either, let's say, or maybe both, a 95% renewables system will work, and that and that in a decarbonizing world, Australia will become an industrial powerhouse, drawing in world industry. What's your confidence in that in particular? That's what I'm really interested in. Give it a number. I'm going to pin you down to a percentage.
I'm extremely confident that a 98% renewable grid as modelled is not only technically feasible, but is the cheapest path forward for Australia. Okay. I am extremely confident that in a decarbonising world, Australia has an enduring advantage. There's a quote about Australia being the lucky country, right? You should read the full quote at some point. It's not a compliment. Yeah. But we are lucky again. We were lucky with gold. We were lucky with wheat. We were lucky with wool. We were lucky with iron ore, oil, gas, coal. We are lucky again. We're lucky with lithium. Like half the world's lithium is coming from Australia right now. We are incredibly lucky with our renewable energy resources, and we will have an enduring economic advantage in a decarbonising world. And Australia should embrace that. We should absolutely embrace that.
Aidan, what's your, do you have any self-doubt? Do you ever wake up in the night thinking you might have got this wrong? Maybe it's an unfair question, but I'm just curious, because you guys both have staked very strong positions.
But can you just state your position?
I'm extremely confident, 98% confident that if we persist past the 40-45% renewable energy, that will be a lot cheaper than, a lot more expensive than the system we currently have. I'm quite confident that using more coal is the cheapest for its sins. I think honesty is required, that with the system we had that is based on coal for Australia would be the cheapest, for sure. I'm 90% confident of that. I think there is almost no chance that we reach net zero there is no chance, zero chance that we reach net zero of the whole economy by 2050. I think it would be ambitious to aim for net zero electricity by 2050, and I think that if we use nuclear, let's see, there's a 75% confidence, we would get to net zero more likely, or lower carbon, total carbon, by 2050 than if we persisted with renewables. And I think that's what I think I think we need to consider. But I think there is just no chance that from here on, persisting with trying to move all this wild energy in the rushes and gushes that it falls across the landscape, to try to tame it and make the kind of reliable, concentrated energy that we've become used to, that is not going to be a cheap system, even if it's abundant in the wild. To kind of firm, clean, domesticated, control it, to produce the sort of electricity we've built our civilization on, that will not be cheap. I'm absolutely confident of that.
I ask a question. I want to ask. I want to leave you with one thing. I want to leave you with a challenge. Right? Pause taking pot shots on where we are right now, and paint a vision. Right? And do the work. Show us that you have a better vision. Show us that you have a path. Right? Show us what it's going to cost. Show us what the emissions trajectory is going to be, and show us how we keep the lights on until you can realize it. Just do that work.
Final 30 seconds, and then this is the cut.
Absolutely not. Like, we need to realize that we've been given basically a false impression of the current path. So the first thing that has to be done is to get the full system cost. And if that sounds like pot shots, guilty as charged. But we have to get an honest, full picture of the trajectory we're currently on, so we know what our power bills are going to be in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And until we have an honest idea about whether the current path is sustainable, then we need to get that on the table. Then we'll build up the credible alternative systems.
Gentlemen, it has been a pleasure sitting in the middle here. I don't think I've gotten wet from any saliva going back and forth. You guys are both brilliant, very interesting to listen to, and I think in a weird way sort of complement each other, because I think you are providing high-level criticisms, the one for the other, which can only serve to raise the level of debate. So it's a pleasure to be sitting between you, and thank you so much for this conversation today.